And lastly, let's think about brand threats. Now, a study was done by the UN Global Compact where they surveyed over 1,000 CEOs across various industries across the globe. They found that the top drivers of CEOs' attention on sustainability issues were pressure from investors and especially shareholders. Even more than, the nonprofits that are out protesting them, even more than, say, new government regulation. Now, the reason why is that an impact is something that's going to come and hit their brand. You're going to say, wow, that's going to really impact shareholders that want to be involved or in place or invested with that brand. There's a consumer trend also that shows that millennials, more so than any consumers in any generation, check actually packaging labels to ensure positive social environmental impact. So we think back to the 1980s when dolphin-safe tuna came to rise, when people were worried about the brand that StarKist and other fishing companies were facing because they were catching dolphins in their nets, and what the social impact was having and what the impact was to their brand. That seemed like a one-off. Or the sweatshop labor issues of the 80s. Now you're starting to see millennials are actually checking the packaging of every product they're looking at. From a brand perspective, if you're thinking about the resiliency of your company for the long term, what's that business continuity? It's not just about risk, but it's also about that opportunity for capturing those millennial consumers and Gen X and Gen Ys as well, and saying, where is that business opportunity? How can we be more resilient? How can we be more responsive, both from an environmental and social perspective? And I'm going to talk about that right now. How do companies assess the brand threats to their organization? Well, you can do that in any number of ways. You see that from an environmental perspective, consumer and employee preferences to support organizations that match their values, social and environmentally, are dramatically on the rise. Environmental inaction or disasters can linger in people's minds. I mentioned the BP oil spill, but if you ask anybody in Gen X, what industry do you think of when you think of oil spill? They'll still think back to Exxon in 1989. Just go ask any of your colleagues about, sweatshop labor. What's the company that comes to mind from 1987? They'll tell you. I bet it's the same one. So as organizations are trying to assess their brand threats from an environmental perspective, saying who's made climate commitments and who hasn't? And if companies haven't, why not? Analysts are actually increasingly looking at companies' CSR reports, their CDP reports, whether they've got disclosures on their climate risk to insurers to assess how are they doing on environmental issues. And they're factoring that into how they look at a company and assess their brand. Take, for example, companies like Kimberly-Clark or Weyerhaeuser, which are in the paper products industry. And they were having to take, massive steps to not only ensure that they weren't, deforesting the areas that they were, logging their paper, but also what are the proactive steps that they're taking to regenerate it? And you think about it from a business long-term enterprise value perspective, they want to regenerate and take care of that forest as best as possible for the enterprise financial and brand impact of their business for the long term. Take, for example, a company like Starbucks, which actually proactively came out and decided that it was going to look to certify its palm oil that was in its products or its food, because they were realizing that they could make these environmental commitments. But if they were buying palm oil from the sources in Borneo where all the rainforests are being cut down and being replaced by palm oil, they realized they weren't doing the right thing. So organizations are trying to figure out from a resiliency perspective, where's that brand impact, not only from a risk perspective, but from an opportunity of saying, we're doing the right thing. We're taking a leadership position on that. And again, on the social side, it's a little easier to think about the brand impacts. Workplace conditions stick in people's minds for decades. Nike, Walmart, people boycotting products. You get, Firestone tires, what happened, with the Ford Explorer incident and what impacted the brand. You've got divestment movements that are attacking shareholder values on companies, where you're seeing, as movements like this start happening in terms of brand value, they not only impact the brand, but that also comes back to the bottom line. And increasingly, analysts are looking at companies' CSR reports, again, on workplace, human rights, community issues, employment issues, diversity issues, payment issues, minimum wage issues. And so as these issues rise to the forefront, you see that if a business wants to protect itself, be more resilient, be thinking for the long term, they need to be taking these social issues into their mindset going forward.